Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagoro. Now let's discuss the so-called 6 key strategies that have been developed to support national development in Africa in general and Nigeria in particular. Strategies that would reposition the continent and usher in a golden period of wealth and prosperity, according to the developers. They say they are working with countries and businesses to create a framework for the adoption of these strategies, and that if they are applied to their business and economic models, they will receive favorable attention from global capital institutional investors. These include what's being called a China strategy for Nigerian and African entrepreneurs, and a digital strategy which could reposition millions of African businesses, to mention just 2. Well, for more on all that, I'm joined now in the studio by the President and CEO of the Nicky Okoye Foundation, or organization, Dr. Nicky Okoye, who's an expert in developing strategies and structures to mobilize entrepreneurs and governments. He's worked with Merrill Lynch as a financial consultant and is a co-founder and one-time group executive director of Transcorp PLC, and he also served as the chief strategy officer for the Nigerian Stock Exchange. And I reel out those things so that people know that you know what you're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's talk about these 6 strategies. We talked about the China strategy, the digital strategy, but you've also got the agricultural strategy and others. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so for the China strategy, in 2020, China will be joining the high-income countries. It's already very difficult for Chinese manufacturers and Chinese companies to pay engineers. The Chinese engineers are now commanding high-income salaries, and it has become strategic and imperative for Chinese companies to seek manufacturing bases outside of China that are much cheaper and much more inexpensive for those factories to operate. So in the next 2 years, and that's by 2020, China will be exporting, and going forward 5 years from there, over 85 million jobs. They will need to move those factories out of China. So a lot of these companies are currently looking for bases across the world that have those competitive advantages, especially in low-income wages for qualified personnel that can meet with the standards, so Chinese manufacturing can continue to go on in those countries. Because remember that these companies already have customers in Europe, United States, and across the world. So we believe, and we have spoken with some of these global capital investors, they are willing to fund those movements, those transfers of those factories to bases in Africa. Ethiopia has done a good job of doing some positioning. So a lot of the textile companies are beginning to move and set up bases in some of Ethiopia's industrial centers.
But do you really see the Chinese, because I mean obviously the need for jobs in their own country, they've got a massive population, is going to keep growing, and at the same time you're going to have people emerging from universities and so on in China, entry-level position people who could fill those jobs?
Absolutely. I mean, the Chinese people are very, very serious. The president and the government of China recently appointed, I think it was about 780,000, young, skilled workers, and their job is to go into the communities, into the hinterlands, into the heartland of China, and re-educate the last remaining poor people they have in China. Their strategy is in the next 2 to 3 years, there will be no more poor people in China. So
and it looks like they're moving towards achieving that.
They're going to get it. They're going to get there. And so it means that if we want to take advantage of those jobs that they're going to be exporting out of China, then the China strategy must be adopted.
So how are countries best positioned, or how should they best position themselves to get their hands on those jobs?
Well, the first thing is that we need to have industrial centers, industrial estates, high quality industrial estates, because the guy in China doesn't want to come and start setting up from scratch. He wants to move into an industrial estate that has established warehouses, has power, has water, has, you know, all the things that the factory would need.
And which are all the things that Nigeria doesn't have.
Well,
so that means the job is going to go somewhere else.
For now, it's going somewhere else. But if we can get ready, it doesn't take a year,
right.
12 months, 18 months to set up industrial
Okay,
centers.
I want to try and get to the other strategies, because in the second bit I want to talk to you about something related but slightly different.
Absolutely.
So the other strategy is, of course, the digital strategy. Tell us about that.
Well, so the digital strategy, we are in the fourth industrial revolution, and there is a huge shift towards digitization, big data. Everything now in terms of business and commerce internationally depends on your ability to connect. We're connecting through our mobile devices, we're connecting through our laptops. Now in Africa, many of the businesses, especially the small and medium scale business, are not yet digitized. So there is a huge opportunity to digitize the African SME population. If you go to a place like Onitsha Market or Alaba Market in Lagos, you find out that you have hundreds of thousands of traders who are doing billions of dollars a year in revenues, but they have no digital footprint. They have no digital strategy at all. And many of them will be out of business in 5 years if they do not now take a digital strategy. And so the opportunity is for those who will take on that assignment and go to these markets, go to the SME populations, wherever they may be, and get them into the digital
And of course, once those businesses are digitized, that will in turn give them a new kind of business, perhaps a bigger consumer base.
Exactly, a bigger pie. And for them, it gives them access to be able to tap into the real economy. So they can borrow money, they can get access to credit. It becomes easy to see exactly what they're doing. But one of the most exciting strategies from the 6 that we mentioned is actually the diaspora strategy. And the Nigerian diaspora population as a group is earning, in annual earnings, over $270 billion a year. Now, if you put them together as a country, they're larger than 3/4 of African countries as far as GDP is concerned. So that into itself is a virtual country. And what we are saying is that there needs to be a strategy to go after this group as a market. Now, if you look at the figures that these folks are sending home to Nigeria, the last figures I saw was about 25 billion for 2018 in terms of remittances. Now, but this money is money that is coming home to help mom with her, telecom charges, help pay school fees, and so on and so forth. However, if we were able to look at that marketplace as a market, then we could offer them services, products and services that would enhance the opportunity to do more business in Nigeria and across Africa. The last time I was in DC, just a few weeks ago, 3 radio stations on the radio, I was in a car and I kept turning. We're playing Nigerian music, what we call Afrobeat.
Yes, I've experienced that quite a lot in nightclubs in the middle of London somewhere.
Exactly. Now, what does that tell you?
And these are mainstream nightclubs.
These are mainstream nightclubs and mainstream radio stations across the United States. I experienced it in DC, but I hear in LA, in New York, in Houston. We have crossed over. So what that means is that the diaspora population had a pull effect on the consumption of Nigerian
That's a very
music.
good point.
And that means that that diaspora effect is a market.
Right.
So how do we take on other products and enhance the creative industry, so enhance our movies, enhance our music consumption in those markets, and then expand that to arts and craft.
Right.
I mean, we have an arts and craft industry that has not yet crossed over.
Although it is crossing over, because we've actually done programs now. I mean, you've got like, the big sort of trading, companies in the UK, Christie's, the auction houses and so on, holding huge auctions on African arts. Now let's move on, because I want to get, I find this very, very interesting. I want to get to the other strategies before we take a break. Another one is the agricultural strategy.
Yeah, so the agricultural strategy is huge. Basically, Nigeria does about $29 billion a year in crude oil sales. But we looked at 10 products. cassava alone, if you took cassava alone, Nigeria is the #1 producer of cassava in the entire world. We're producing about 54 million metric tons a year. Now, if you aggregate that in terms of processing, if we processed cassava into starch, which, as you know, is used in almost every pharmaceutical, every tablet you take, that white stuff is starch. The effective agent is added to the starch to make up a tablet. So the pharmaceutical industry almost exclusively depends on starch. And then you have, other inputs and other processes that it can be turned into, like alcohol and so on and so forth. But if you do the processing of cassava, you could earn between $15 to $20 billion. Cassava alone. Now, if you add that to cashew currently we're doing about just over 200,000 metric tons. We're #3 in the world in terms of production of cashew. But cashew presently earns for us about $780 million a year. Now, if you process cashew, it has a 10 times value after processing.
And that's what's missing, isn't it?
Which means you
the
can
value
$7
chain.
billion. That value chain is completely missing in Nigeria. Right. So just those 10 products alone would do 4 times the value that we're earning in
okay,
oil.
We've got a minute before we take a break. Let's hear the last 2 strategies briefly.
Okay, so the other one is the local content strategy. Now, local content has done effectively well in the oil and gas industry. I mean, we took an industry that did not have a local content strategy from 2010, and within 10 years, we have been able to turn an entire generation of multi-billionaires and millionaires. We've gotten over 200,000 to 300,000 Nigerians employed in the oil and gas value chain. We have gotten companies doing billions of dollars in transactions that they never had before. So the value has been tremendous to the GDP of the Nigerian nation. Now, what we need to do is to extend the local content strategy to other industries. Telecommunications, construction, education. Why are we educating people abroad? Medical services. Why are we going
Okay, I'm going to ask you to just hold on. We'll get to that last one when we come back. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about development strategies that are aiming to attract investments to Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolo. Now, if you're an entrepreneur or a business that's developing in Nigeria or Africa, then you want to hear about and take part in development strategies to attract investments to Africa. EU countries, as well as Asian nations like Japan and China, and of course the US, have created funding support schemes which could potentially provide much needed financial support for businesses in Nigeria and Africa to expand and take advantage of market opportunities. There's apparently around $60 billion available from the US, $40 billion from the EU, and around $50 billion from Japan and China, part of sovereign and national funding support for projects in Africa. So how do you get your hands on this pool of investment money? Well, with me in the studio, the president and CEO of the Nicky Okoye organization, Dr. Nicky Okoye. He's worked with Merrill Lynch as a financial consultant and is a co-founder and one-time group executive director of Transcorp PLC, and he also served as the chief strategy officer for the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Thank you for staying with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Let's just talk about that last strategy that we're talking about, development strategy, before we move on to discuss this section.
Absolutely. So the last strategy is what we call the Africa Content Strategy. We look at it from 2 sides. First of all, there's the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement. 54 nations have signed to create one single market, and that single market provides opportunities for companies to do their trading across the African continent. But more importantly is what we call the Africa Content, which means how do you have a product or a service that provides some content that is partly African and use it to deploy a strategy within national development. So a good example of an Africa content strategy, which we are proposing to the government of Mozambique, is Mozambique has two or three of the largest LNG projects in Africa today. There's the Anadarko, which has been acquired by Total, $29 billion investment in an LNG train, 2 LNG trains. Then there is the Mobile LNG project, which is Rovuma area. That is a $33 billion investment. And then there is the Eni floating LNG project, which is $8 billion. Collectively, Mozambique, which is a poor country with a $12 billion GDP, is going to have a $70 billion investment over the next 5 years. So it's going to be phenomenal. So what we have proposed is that they take advantage of an Africa strategy. Mozambique has a growing entrepreneurship community. They don't have the capacity to participate the way we do. So Nigeria is much more mature in the Nigeria content or the local content strategy. So we're taking Nigerian companies, Ghanaian companies, and other companies across Africa to Mozambique to participate in what we call the Africa content strategy, so that we can provide support to the entrepreneurs in Mozambique for them to participate in this exploding LNG industry that is about to take off.
That's very interesting. Now let's move on and talk about how a business or an entrepreneur can get their hands on this pool of investment money that we talked about, you've talked about, with billions of dollars from the US, Japan, China, the EU, that sort of thing. How can these entrepreneurs access these pools of investment capital with particular focus on financial support that I understand is available from China, the EU, the US?
Yes, absolutely. There are over $250 billion available, China, EU, the United States, and so on. So what we have done is that we've set up a process. And that process means we get companies, we do an assessment. Not every company can qualify.
Right.
So the first thing is to have an assessment. And we have trained teams that are carrying out those assessments. After the assessment has been done and we believe you qualify, then we will take you to make an application that your project qualifies to get your hands on this money. So sometimes it could be the United States, and sometimes it could be Europe, sometimes it could be China. So what they need to do is to contact us. Our website is www.nickyokoye.com, and that's NICKYOKOYE.com. And so they come to the website, and there's an email there. They click on it, and they can just indicate their interest, and we take it from there. Because we do have a process. We're not expecting to grab everybody from the street, because a lot of companies might not qualify, but there are some very good.
But what are the criteria?
Well, the criteria is
briefly.
Well, it's good to have a good structure. That's most importantly. We have a structure we call Business Excellence Matrix. So if you don't have the structure, then we can support you to create that structure. And that, so if you come today, you might not be ready for 6 months, or you might not be ready for 12 months. So with the business,
well, you help prepare them.
We help prepare them. Yeah. So either way,
assuming you're confident enough in whatever it is they're doing.
Absolutely. So once they come to us, either way, they're going to end up sometime in the future getting access to this money. Could be today, maybe they're ready, or it could be in a year's time. They will take some time to get ready. But most importantly is that there's a structure, there's a strategy. So we make sure you have the structure, then we make sure you have the strategy, then we make sure you have the right people, because the deal always breaks down with execution. So if you have the right people, you have the right strategy, you have the right structure, you're going to get the money.
Okay, well, let's talk about, because you were the chief strategy officer for the Nigerian Stock Exchange.
Yes.
And for instance, how London is the financial hub and the nerve center for listings and so on in Europe. Which city do you see playing that role in Africa as the continental free trade area that you talked about takes shape? Lagos, Johannesburg, Cairo, Nairobi. What would be the attraction to an investor to choose one of these cities as their primary listing location?
Good question. Ghana has already tried to corner the actual office for the free trade area. Now, the jury is out as far as where the financial center would be. I think it depends largely on the elites of that particular country, not necessarily on the government. So if the financial system in Nigeria really wants Nigeria to be the financial capital for the free trade area, then there are certain strategies and there are certain things we can do now that would make it happen by default. So if you go to Addis Ababa, to AU, and start trying to make a case, which is what Ghana did. Ghana got the the administrative secretariat, but for the financial, you would probably need to put some things in place.
Right.
It's going to happen by default.
And it seems almost Johannesburg seems to be a place that you can...
Well, Johannesburg for now is already the financial center for Africa. So more likely, more often than not, a lot of companies in the United States and Europe tend to, gravitate towards Johannesburg.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that Johannesburg will win. So what it means is that if Lagos, which is already the financial center for Nigeria,
and West Africa, arguably,
and West Africa, arguably, if Lagos does its homework, it could be the center. There are just certain strategies that Lagos needs to take into consideration. Some of them I wouldn't want to talk about here,
right?
Because other countries are watching. This is an African program. But I'll share those strategies with the governor of Lagos. He's a good friend of mine.
Right, and I expect that the African market has a different character and structure than the overseas market, like London or New York or whatever, for instance. So does that make it more likely that we're going to typically see smaller investors and smaller companies coming to list and invest here? I mean, companies that are less than, I don't know, $500 million, $100 million, for instance.
Yes, I mean, that's already happening.
Right.
You have a situation where even in London, London has two separate
But
markets.
that's a potential growth area, though, isn't it?
It is.
I mean,
what I think we haven't done effectively is the Nigerian economy has not been fully captured by the Nigerian capital markets and the stock market. So if you look at the total valuation of the Nigerian capital markets and the Nigerian stock exchange, it's less than, I would say, about 10-15% of GDP. But if you look at New York, for instance, New York is over 100% of GDP, and so it means that there are huge companies in the telecommunications, oil and gas. No oil and gas company of repute is listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. None. You have a few petroleum service companies, the ones that sell, fuel, but none of the big, players. And all those big players are listed in their home countries. No reason why they shouldn't be listed in Nigeria. And when they raise money through the New York Stock Exchange, through their capital markets, which gives health to the capital markets. That hasn't been achieved in Nigeria. So I think there's a mismatch between the leadership of the capital market and the leadership of the political leadership, if you will, because they need to work together.
Right.
When we were there, we used to have twice weekly strategy sessions with President Obasanjo. President Obasanjo believed very strongly in the private sector. And the stock exchange leadership, myself, my boss at that time, we used to go to Abuja almost twice a month to sit down and strategize. And it was during those days that pension reform was born, banking consolidation was taken on, Nigeria started listing its bonds. I mean, we were able to achieve a lot working closely with the political leadership. I think that hasn't happened currently.
Okay, well, let's hope that it happens soon again. Nicky, Dr. Nicky Okoye, I want to thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.